This is Katie, and we are doing police identity over time with a focus on the local police. With the presentation of case studies and academic research, we hope to analyze the intricacies of police identity and how various issues have changed over time. Some of the first persons in law enforcement were called night watches. They were first used in Boston in the mid-1600s. They were volunteers that warned the community of any danger, but were not effective in crime control. They often fell asleep or were drunk while on duty. Some night watches used it to evade military service. Slave patrols were used in southern states in the early 1700s. According to Dr. Gary Potter, slave patrols had three primary functions. 1. To chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves. 2. To provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts. And 3. To maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside of the law if they violated any of the plantation rules. After the Civil War, these organizations became modern police organizations. In 1838, Boston created the first American police force, and by the 1880s, every major city had a police department. According to Lundman, these modern police organizations shared similar characteristics. 1. They were publicly supported and bureaucratic in form. 2. Police officers were full-time employees, not community volunteers or case-by-case fee retainers. 3. Departments had permanent and fixed rules and procedures, and employment as a police officer was continuous. 4. Police departments were accountable to a central governmental authority. Along with this, there was corruption within the police force in the 1890s. This included police officers paying to be on the force, abusing their power, and participating in crimes such as prostitution. This led to anti-corruption movements at the end of the 19th century. August Vollmer was a key figure in dealing with this issue. He is considered the father of modern policing and promoted college education for police officers. He also emphasized diversity on the force, hiring both African Americans and later women. Although policing was becoming more sophisticated, there were still issues that needed to be resolved. In the 1960s, there was police brutality against civil rights protesters. This led to the police image becoming a political priority. During the 1980s, the focus became on community policing. This included solving core issues such as drug dealing instead of dealing with individual cases. Police were also more involved in their community and tried to form relationships. Today there are still obvious issues, but there are also some excellent solutions. One of these that I would like to highlight is a school resource officer. Many of the people in my high school were able to form a good relationship with our resource officer, and I would say that this helped decrease delinquent behavior and give them more respect for police in general. Finally, police psychology has played a huge role in police behavior and how they interact with civilians. It also benefits the police officer and his or her mental health. Justin Coat Canning is a North Dakota police officer who attended LRSC in ND. His training lasted from January to early May, where they would start with physical training in the morning, and then after breakfast they would start the classroom teachings, which ranged from report writing and felony traffic stops to defensive tactics and de-escalation. During their drills, they would attempt to defuse situations where they would sometimes become physical, which would show trainees how fast things could go out of control. The academy is about 550 hours, and since then, Justin has taken an additional 1,180 hours. He said that some agencies do a poor job of training officers. He has worked in 3 agencies himself, and at the first 2 he was driven around and they showed him the town, and at the second place with 2 days of training was thrown the keys and was told to go have fun. The 3rd agency, however, had him with a supervisor for 4 weeks, and they made sure he was comfortable with his duties before sending him out on his own. And since then, his department has revamped the training program to ensure that new officers are exposed to more before being sent out on their own.
Hi, this is Grace speaking. An important aspect of police identity changing over time is the drastic changes in how people perceive or trust the police in 2020. The graph shown is a Gallup poll, which depicts the yearly percent of people that would agree they have confidence in the police. As you can see, 2020 is an all-time low at 19%. This mainly has to do with the widespread uproar towards police brutality, which we will get into later in the presentation. It is important to first define a local police officer's duties and responsibilities. The primary purpose is to uphold the laws of the jurisdiction, provide patrol, and investigate local crimes. These responsibilities include enforcing laws, preventing crime, responding to emergencies, and providing support services. Just for the sake of understanding what is included in a local police department, this chart shows specifically the City of Bismarck Police Department. In this presentation, we will be focusing on regular officers. A thorough background check is necessary in the selection standards for applicants. Aspects such as work experience, driving record, criminal history, financial history, and even their social networking are taken into account during the hiring process. Psychological testing is key in evaluating potential officers as well. According to a study by Kuntz and Anderson in 1988, the most notable attributes for an ideal policeman are showing restraint in terms of emotional expressiveness without either overly enthusiastic or reserved, being a disciplined team worker without being overly dependent on others, and having a realistic and pragmatic thinking style without being disdainful of authority. While aspects such as college education are common in police currently, there is much criticism about how long they actually train for their occupation. According to an article published in CBS News in June of 2020, the Minneapolis Police Academy trains young, soon-to-be officers for 16 weeks before they are assigned weapons and sent out into the streets as rookie cops. They spend 6 months prepared with training officers, which shows them the ropes. This table shows the contrast between the U.S. and Norway in the amount of time their officers spend in training. In the U.S., it can range between 10 and 36 weeks, but in Norway, they spend 3 years in police university. 2 of these years are spent on police science and ethics study, and 1 year on on-the-ground training. Another interesting fact to note is the weapon protocol for local police in Finland. Police are armed in Finland, but rarely use their guns, just roughly 10 times per year, because they are taught that they should only reach for their weapons in the most dire situations. Next, we will look at the agenda of the local police officer. In a crisis, an officer's agenda should be centered around containment and de-escalation. Each situation an officer is in may require a different communication strategy to reach with that goal. Additionally, an assertive response to dealing with a stressful situation is most effective.
This is Laiken, and I will be talking about ego states and the force continuum and different case studies to go along with that. The chart on the left with ego states was largely derived from Freud's work in the different factions of personality. Freud concluded that there was an id, which is our emotional and irrational self, an ego, which is our rational self, and a superego, which is our moral self. However, it was Eric Berne who took Freud's ego state and saw through human interaction that our conscious ego state actually has 3 different components: a parent, an adult, and a child. Berne thought that the best and final stage was the adult because it took both the child's role of pure feeling and the parent's role of pure observation and brought them together to make a rational decision. Arguably, Freud and psychoanalytic theory also play a role in the development of the force continuum. As we have learned in class, stress can alter officers' judgment and create a situation where they're acting unconsciously based on training. In the 1980s, the force continuum was created but wasn't widely taught until the 1990s. According to Albert Rodriguez, who taught officers the proper use of force during this time, there was many more reports of deadly force before training due to the different methods of training, but never even mentioned de-escalation techniques. Psychoanalytics would argue that this has to do with the officer's unconscious self driving their actions during high stress. Essentially, with no to minimal training, a normal response would be to shoot first, ask questions later, in order to save ourselves. This is why the development and continued training on the continuum is essential. Going off the psychology behind deadly force, George Floyd provides an excellent example of possible lack of training or rationalism. Although this is a widely debated case, the court system ruled that the use of lethal force could not be endorsed. The officer was charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter, in many aspects due to the use of the force continuum. It was ruled that although George Floyd was resisting arrest, he was physically contained and could not harm the public or officers. It was also decided that there was no reason to be on Floyd's neck and that this action is not an approved technique of gaining control. It is frowned upon to apply force to the head or the neck, according to District Attorney Tanizaki. The George Floyd case is an excellent example of the use of force continuum being used as a method of determining legal punishments for improper deadly force and possible lack of training. Another example of police brutality due to the inadequate training of other possible de-escalation techniques is that of the case of Ronnie King. Ronnie King was involved in a high-speed chase for drunk driving. After evading arrest, LA officers severely beat King, striking him with their batons between 53 and 56 times. The police chief of the LAPD, Daryl Gates, determined that these 4 officers used excessive force, though 3 of the 4 were acquitted. After the verdict, violent riots took place and led to the case being taken to the federal district court, where 2 of the officers received life in prison. After his death, his daughter, Lori King, worked with LAPD to create reform and build bridges between the department and the African American community by creating the Rodney King Foundation for Social Justice and Human Rights.
Hi, this is Emily, and I'm going to be talking about mental health. Some factors that cause mental health problems are long hours, exposure to critical incidents, being the focus of public criticisms, physical demands, and on-the-job injuries. While it is not really possible to train people for what they are going to experience mentally, awareness and resources could help them on their path to become an officer. In a study done in 2015, it was discovered that on average, police officers experience roughly 188 critical incidents. They often present with higher rates of depression, substance abuse, and suicide than the general public. Some reasons that an officer might not try and seek help could be the fear of losing their job, or they do not want to look weak. When police trauma syndrome comes into the picture, some impacts that can come from this are substance abuse, aggression, marital and family problems, and suicide. 1 out of 4 police officers on the street have a substance abuse problem. This is estimated to range from 20 to 30% of police officers compared to the 10% of the general public. Alcohol abuse could be caused by a social standard by other officers, such as because of celebration or just to relax after their long day on duty. If an officer is injured on the job, that could cause them to be prescribed to opioids for pain relief, and then later become addicted to abuse them. About 1/5 of officers are frequently frustrated on the job, causing them to view the public differently. When they are not appreciated by the public and accused of doing things wrong constantly, this can cause them to view the public as needy and ungrateful, which can make them be more aggressive when it is unnecessary. In compassion fatigue, an officer can become more apathetic towards the community, towards the people who need help, says Thomas Coughlin, a clinical psychologist and retired New York Police Department detective. If police officers perceive that citizens have turned against them and that people they are supposed to help hate them, then they can become more apathetic towards those people. When they lose empathy for the people you need the most, that's the real problem. 40% of officers reported taking their stressors out on their family. This is when their marriage is starting to fail and their relationships with their children are starting to diminish. More police die by suicide 3 times more than in the line of duty. This would be about 1 in 4 officers that have even considered committing suicide. As of August 2020, a total of 134 officers have committed suicide. Some prevention advocates say that these statistics don't even reflect the true numbers of suicide, as some families choose to record the death as just an accident or even an accidental overdose. While this does not seem like a large amount, it is still less than other years. This is due to the fact that the officers felt like they are needed due to COVID. After the riots started, it is projected that the suicide among police officers would spike again. The riots are diminishing the sense of need, since so many people are saying we should abolish law enforcement. When looking at the Blue Help website, although currently there are 147 law enforcement suicides, compared to last year's 236, which looks to be the highest number in the past 5 years.
This is Julia, and I will be talking about PTSD in police. It is estimated that approximately 15% of police officers experience PTSD symptoms. A study was conducted where EEGs were recorded when police were presented with a decision-making situation. Results showed officers who have higher PTSD levels had great brain activation in areas of the brain related to rapid decision-making. These disruptions may impact brain systems due to increased arousal to threats, and may lead to the inability to keep attention. The best solution for PTSD is prevention. As it is hard to treat, we want to focus on preventing it from the start.
Of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the U.S., approximately only 5% currently have suicide prevention training programs. Another source of stress relief could be stress management courses and exercise programs. If an officer is uncomfortable with seeking psychological help from the department, then going through a doctor to get their needs best suited is another route to go. Some things that the departments could do to help fellow officers is to have a better leadership for mental health. This could be by showing a good standpoint on it and as soon as the officers start working there, to show them that it is normal to speak up and for the department to be their support system. Another thing that law enforcement could take into action is something they were thinking about for military. What was said there is you could do physical training every morning. Let's do mental training once or twice a week. Centralizing mental health resources could relieve some of the stigma around mental health and seeking help, as well as teaching them how to recognize the symptoms for themselves at an earlier point in time.
In 2015, the Department of Justice went in and did an investigation on the Chicago Police Department after the release of a video showing a white police officer fatally shooting black teenager Laquan McDonald to determine whether the Chicago PD was engaging in pattern or practice of unlawful conduct. Chicago PD has a 60% higher rate of suicide than the national average. This is suspected to be related to the high crime rates in Chicago. These officers face more trauma resulting from high amounts of gun violence and murder. Officers felt morale was low with coworkers and that they didn't have support in their departments or in the community. They also revealed that they did not feel sufficiently prepared or trained. In a follow-up, the Department of Justice noticed that the lawfulness and effectiveness could be vastly improved. They emphasized rewarding effective, ethical, and active policing. Diligent officers told them that they were eager for change. They also made an anonymous hotline to report police misconduct. Roundtables were community events to help establish and build rapport between the police and citizens in Chicago, especially in the neighborhoods that have high amounts of gun violence. Focus areas moving forward included force, accountability, training and supervision, officer wellness and safety, data collection and transparency, promotions, and community-focused policing.